our conference entitled Photography Museum Narratives, organized by the Archaeology of Photography Foundation. I welcome Dr. Karolina Lewandowska, who is the founder and the president of the foundation. The co-organizer of the conference is the National Institute of National Heritage, and the National Museum in Warsaw. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am myself very interested to hear the discussion at this session because with a long career as a museum employee, I remember times when photography was recognized purely for its documentary properties, and later down the line, our colleague pointed out that there is a tremendously rich hoard of photos that we have, which can be the start of a very interesting museum. Our museum turned 150 years old last year, but it faces terrible shortages of space to develop areas and aspects of its functioning that were slighted for decades, and now they seem to be our jewels in the crown. I'm very happy that this conference has such a distinguished international faculty. We are very eager to hear your opinions. I wish all of you a great day, and I'm starting to listen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A few bits of housekeeping information. I think it's great that we can meet here and discuss issues of photography, that our distinguished guests have found time in their crammed agendas to come to Warsaw for a couple of days, and the fact that we have quite large turnout means that photographic collections and exhibitions are something that do not leave us cold. I am very also happy to collaborate with a large national institution that has undertaken to work with an NGO that has a completely different scale and scope, and that the National Institute of Museums, Museology, has also lent a hand. We're very happy that an open dialogue is starting about photography exhibiting institutions. A few words about the sources of this conference. At least two can be pointed out. One of them is the need for a public debate about the need to create a location for photography exhibition in Warsaw, at least, and to set up an institution that would do some intense work on photography. This is something that should be discussed not only by museum administrators and curators, but also also to discuss with the general public and people who have been responsible for such locations, such institutions all over the world. I think we all intuitively feel that we need such a location for photography here in Warsaw, but the question remains open as to what it means to create a place purely dedicated to photography. Perhaps this is an outdated concept, or what to do to avoid making it an outdated concept, what to do to avoid narrowing down the issue of photography to its own photographic area. Photography is one of the visual arts. It is also present in institutions that are active in the area of visual arts. That also leads to a situation, on the other hand, that photography is less present than we would like it to be. So the question remains what we can do to change that. It is also a question of the identity of such a place. Another significant aspect is the need to exchange experiences, not only between museum directors, but also among people who collect and popularize photography. The experience of large institutions we find very interesting, especially as we are starting here as a grassroots initiative. We would like to find out what's done all around the world, and there is an intensive discussion or contention what solutions to choose, how to select works for a collection. Whether we decide to sell something that we have in our collection. Should we collect everything or do it selectively? How to profile collections, how to popularize and show collections. This is highly important because this later carries over to how a photography functions in the public space, public awareness. We also need to mention something that happened almost 25 years ago, a conference, which discussed archives on the one hand, on the other hand, museum collections that was staged in Gorzów Wielkopolski. In the 1980s, Gorzów Wielkopolski was a center that organized very progressive, interesting seminars on photography. An interesting community would come and visit and participate in these events. And very many interesting photographic collections were fostered in or by Gorzów. And perhaps we're wrong, but it seems that it was one of the first discussions on world exhibitions. Urszula Czartoryska wrote an interesting text in reference to that. So the duration of discussion and thinking of photographic collections in Poland has come of age, so to say. I would not like to prolong this unduly, but I have several remarks about the program, plus housekeeping comments. As you look at the program, you may feel that there is a paucity of small private institutions there, that large public institutions or just large-scale institutions have taken over. This follows from the fact that several of our invitees could not come, and the majority of them were affiliated to small private institutions. But I think we are going to have a diversity of views and contexts anyhow. There is a change. Mark Robbins of the International Center of Photography has cancelled his participation at the last moment, but we were very fortunate because Agnès Fey came privately, and she agreed that she will tell us about the history of the Centre Pompidou collection. She was a curator there, and she studied the history of that department, and she graciously agreed to be the last speaker of the day and tell us about it.
So the first speaker is Jaroslav Anděl, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing many years now in New York and in Prague. You have a concise overview of yourself here, Jaroslav, as a prolific author whose works we have read for many years on Czech modernism and on media arts generally, and issues in design and book creation. Currently, and for 5 years now, Jaroslav has been the director of DOX, a Center for Contemporary Art in Prague, a very interesting institution that is privately funded and presents shows in contemporary art across media. Monographic shows, for instance, on Krzysztof Wojcicko, as well as thematic shows such as Disabled by Normality. These are the most recent, and has written a book called, in English, Reflecting on Photography, A Guide to Modernity in an Anthology of Texts. And Jaroslav will be speaking today on narratives of making and collecting photographs. I think you get to sit down now.
Dzień dobry. Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Matthew, for an introduction. Thank you, Karolina, for inviting me to this important conference. I should say that I was in touch in the 1970s with people active and important in the field of photography, primarily Ursula Czartoryska, Jerzy Olek, and some others, and it's a great pleasure to be back here in Warsaw. So my presentation will focus on a kind of a broad historical overview of narratives of collecting. I will start with 2 images. What you see is 2 collections of images placed in caves. On your left, there is the Lascaux cave in France. On your right, there is the Corbis collection, which was placed several years ago, as you might know, also in a cave in Silver Mountains in Tennessee in the US. Now, it's obvious that there are very different functions and narratives behind this assembly of images. In the first case, obviously, the function was magical. And as we know, this is the very beginning of symbolic forms such as language, religion, art. On our right, the narrative, of course, is very different. The purpose of Corbis collection, which was originally Bettman collection, of course, was commercial, to deal in images, to make profit. But this activity would not be possible, again, without some symbolical meaning, notably creating collective memory. Now, the premise here is that making and collecting photographs are connected, and they are driven by specific narratives. Second, these narratives have their history and they are changing. Now, I have been interested in this subject for many, many years, and already in the 1970s, I do a lot of research into these narratives, and quite recently, I published this book, Matthew already mentioned, which is basically hundreds and hundreds of quotes, texts, which are actually documenting and mapping out these narratives and their histories and more importantly, how they are all connected, how they are creating bigger story. Of course, what we call archaeology of images and archaeology of photography is connected again with a very specific narrative, or I should say narratives. So two most well-known inventors of photography, Mr. Daguerre and Mr. Niepce, both Frenchmen, represent these two very different traditions. Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre was a painter, and he was associated with this tradition of making illusions, which was the field of painting. The primary principle of this field in the Western tradition, of course, was the principle of mimesis, imitation, creating illusions, simulations of reality. On the other hand, Niepce was not a painter. Niepce was primarily an inventor. And inspired by the invention of lithography, a revolutionary printing technique, he explored this field, and that's how he came to this invention of heliography, that is a version of photography. So you see image on the bottom is dated 1825, and it's a copy, it's a heliographic reproduction of a Flemish picture. Now, these two distinct narratives, of course, can be traced to the very beginning of making images. We can go back to the caves, and you see two examples dated about the same, 20,000 years ago. The first image shows you how already then people were able to create an illusion on flat surface, to create an illusion of depth. And this was made by actually finding shapes and images already and projecting certain images into them and complementing them. So there is a process of making and finding together, which, as Ernst Gombrich showed in his important book, Art and Illusion, are primary principles of image making. On the other hand, you have principle of reproduction made by making traces and imprints. And this, of course, principle enables you to multiply images in a way to reproduce them. Now, there is very important and distinct quality in this principle, which is today mostly called indexical, which means there is kind of ontological relationships between the original and reproduction. Now, what photography did was that this invention connected these two principles on a new level. And now the third most well-known inventor of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot, actually is representing this kind of connection of these two principles in most illustrative way. What you see, it's a well-known, of course, photograph of Talbot's establishment in Reading in England, and you see people both making images and reproducing them, multiplying them. How was this made? Why was it so revolutionary? Because it was made on the basis of science and technology. And this is indeed a revolutionary fact. Now, this could happen only in a broader social, economic context. And this context, of course, is Industrial Revolution. Now, just few facts which indicate how this broader context of industrial revolution is actually sometimes directly linked to prehistory of photography. So just few facts. Elizabeth Fulham, Scottish scientist, published in 1794 an essay on combustion. She actually writes about silver nitrates and how they can be used for coloring textiles. Now this is very important because textile industry was the prime driver of industrial revolution. Humphrey Davy and Thomas Wedgwood, who collaborated, and Humphrey Davy published this one of the first papers which actually paves the way to the invention of photography. And again, Wedgwood family is again involved in industrial revolution, in this case in production and manufacturing of porcelain. And Niepce and his brother patented in 1807 first combustion engine. So you see how it's all connected to this broader context of industrial revolution. And finally, Charles Babbage, of course, who is mostly today known as a kind of godfather of the computer, published in 1832 a book on the economy of machinery and manufacturing. Now, you don't find this book mentioned in history of photography. Nevertheless, this is very, very important because what he did is basically that he described the kind of theory of manufacturing, of management. And in this book, there is a whole chapter on reproduction. And then you have really, in that period, already very precisely described how reproduction is important for industrial society. Now, Czech journalist Karel Havlíček-Borovský, who was the most important journalist in Bohemia, and also he was representatives of liberalism. He wrote in the 1850s, industry is something that brings about permanent motion. Now, this can be paraphrased that in this way, that industrial technology is driving permanent change, and the question is how this change can be institutionalized. The whole history of photography, including institutions and narratives of collecting, can be framed in this way. So I will basically follow up this argument because I think this is really what is behind even conference like this. The question why it took so long to create institutions of photography which would collect and assemble and study and interpret photographs not only as documents of objects but also as objects in their own right. Now, why is it so late? Why it took so many years? And the reason is that it was a revolutionary way to make images. And traditional institutions had really a big difficulty and still do how to deal with this innovation. One example I start with is year 1851. There are two important events which happened. The periodical La Lumière and Société Héliographique were created in Paris. And in the same year, there was a great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, usually called Great Exhibitions in London. Now, La Lumière and Société Héliographique are actually first attempt to create an institution for photography. It's the very beginning of what can be called emancipatory movement for photography. But how this can be related to the other event, this great exhibition? Because again, usually in histories of photography, there is not direct, when there is some text about this, it's usually that photographs were part of the exhibitions. But I think the connection is much deeper, because photographs from the very beginning were used actually to collect objects, to create documents or reproductions and collect them from many different places. And what this exhibition did was exactly the same, to collect many different objects to document this important new narrative of industrial revolution. Now, this event, the Great Exhibition, was at the very beginning of creating museums, museums of a new kind, museums which in the future became, most of them, actually home for photography. And of course, objects from the Great Exhibitions were placed in what was later named Victoria Albert Museum in London. Opened 1857, and the image of the building is from 1909. Now, I will follow on specific examples in Czech Republic, historically in Bohemia and Moravia. So first response to this new development was what is called today Náprstek Museum in Prague. Wojciech Náprstek, who was the founder of this institution, opened Industrial Museum in Prague. But even before that, in the 1860s, he organized industrial exhibitions. And his story is actually very interesting. In 1848, he studied in Vienna. He was a student and took part in revolution, 1848 revolution. And of course, he was to be arrested and persecuted, so he fled to the United States. And that's where he learned about all these innovations. And in the 1860s, he came back and started his kind of enlightenment education of the Czech public. So in 1874, he opened this industrial museum, but he kept building his collection, and his activity actually preceded creation of 3 different museums in Prague. One is Technical Museum, another is Museum of Decorative Arts, third is Ethnological Museum, and he was also instrumental, of course, with his exhibitions. He paved the way to first big industrial exhibition in Prague in 1891, which was basically variation on the Great Exhibition in London. These exhibitions, of course, were all over Western world. In each big city, you find these exhibition grounds, and history goes back to the 19th century. Now, again, as was the case with the Great Exhibition and Victoria and Albert Museum, objects assembled for this exhibition were basis of National Technical Museum, which was created step by step. What you see is the building from 1930s, but in terms of typology of the building, there is a clear connection which goes back to Crystal Palace of the Great Exhibition. So this Museum of Technology in the Kingdom of Bohemia, this was the first name, was founded in 1908. 1910, first exhibition. 1911, there was a new department of printing technologies created, including photography. And now what is important is that in this presentation of printing technologies, there were not only inventors and scientists involved, such as Jakub Husník, but also photographer artists, such as Vladimír Bufka. So there is another narrative entering into these institutions, and that's aesthetic narrative, pictorial narrative, which again is associated with very particular artistic movements. And as we will see further, this played again very important role, how institutions incorporated photography into their collections. Finally, in 1923, there was a film and phototechnology collection. Very important collector and curator Jindřich Brychta actually created one of the best collections of prehistory of cinematography in Europe. Now, another institution which has the same roots, as I already mentioned, Museum of Decorative Arts. In Central Europe, in Germany, there is this term Kunstgewerbe Museum. And of course, Bohemia and Moravia then was part of Habsburg monarchy. And so followed basically same pattern. Now, collection of photography at that museum has about 55,000 prints and 30,000 negatives. Institution was founded in 1885 by the Czech Chamber of Commerce. Building finished 1900. Already 1910, there was an exhibition of photographs on 75th anniversary of invention of photography. 1935, František Drtíkol donated his estate to the museum, although there was still no department of photography there. 1939, there was an important exhibition, 100 years of photography. And officially, collection of photography, although again photographs were in the collection of museum from the very beginning of basically studio photography. But photography as an aesthetic object became policy of the Institute as late as 1970. And the first head was Anna Fárová, which of course was very much active already in the 1950s in the field of photography. So there is a broader context for this, which has to do with this artistic movement and how they interpreted photography. Now, these are two publications which were published in conjunction with this exhibition, 100 Years of Photography. The first is by Rudolf Skopec, who became a bit later renowned historian of photography, but he was also a very important collector. And on your right, you see a catalog of the exhibition. What is interesting that is the cover image of this catalog, which is, of course, light abstraction by Jaromír Funke from the second half of the 1920s. And so you see how different narratives are entering into this traditional approach to photography, notably avant-garde aesthetic. Now, these two scholars, Anna Fárová and Rudolf Skopec, were actually driving forces behind creating some of these collections. So on your right, you see a monograph of Nadar by Rudolf Skopec, published 1960. And on your left, you see a monograph of Henri Cartier-Bresson by Anna Farova, 1958, which is remarkable because this series of monographs was actually, to my knowledge, first of its kind internationally. To that date, many important photographers such as Henri Cartier-Bresson, Paul Strand, and many others did not have their monographs, artistic monographs, and this series, which appeared so early, already established scholarship, new photography scholarship for this field. So this was a background created by scholars, which actually create a new context for collecting and for creating museum collections. Now, most of you probably know this book by Rudolf Skopec from 1963, History of Photography in Pictures from Earliest Ages to the Present. There is also German edition of the book, and it was based on his collection. Now, Rudolf Skopec represents this first generation of historians who were often collectors. We know that Helmut Gernsheim actually worked in similar way. Another example is Van der en Kolk and a few others. So the role of individuals is here important, and also their background is important. Rudolf Skopec actually was born into a family of photographer, and then later he became a teacher, he became also a scholar, historian. By maybe most importantly, by his heart he was collector. Now another Kunstgewerbe museum, in this case in Brno, in Moravia, was founded earlier. It's closer to Vienna, and so it followed the Viennese example very early on. This building is from early, actually, from 1870s, founded 1874. Now, today the collection has about 26,000 photographs and images. And its photography collection was established in 1962. Antonín Dufek was its curator for many, many years, or shortly after the foundation of this collection. He's a well-known scholar in the field of photography. Now, note that in both cases, Prague Museum of Decorative Arts and Moravian Gallery, which was also originally Museum of Decorative Arts, put photography in the department of applied graphics. So this is very typical how traditional institutions deal with photography. There are only very few exceptions. Of course, primary example is Museum of Modern Art, which established its department for film and photography almost since its very beginning. But it is here important to acknowledge that the reason why this was done was inspiration by examples of European avant-garde movements, notably film and photo exhibition in Stuttgart, which was visited by Alfred Barr. Alfred Barr toured Europe at that time, and he realized that film and photography are very important art forms for modern art, and so that was the reason for his decision. Now, there are other collections of photography, but primarily photography is treated as documents, as images of objects. For example, National Museum, which of course has, as many other museums, photography in many different collections. We will probably hear about that from Matthew, about the Art Institute of Chicago, how he finds photographs everywhere, right? Museum of the City of Prague, Museum of Ethnography, Jewish Museum, National Archives. There are many, many photographs like here in Warsaw, but there is also an important collection of Czech Association of Photographers, which is another tradition because these associations were created. Of course, France and England was first countries, and it goes back to the mid-19th century. And they also had collections, so that's a separate tradition of collecting. So I organized about 10 years ago a large exhibition which focused on these different narratives, and that was probably for the first time. All these different collections of photography were placed in historical context and related to each other. So what you see on your right is a cover for that catalog of the exhibition, and subtitle is A Story of a Modern Medium. Yes, I am closing, yeah. So there are some other regional collections. To summarize, what we see, there are multiplicity of narratives, institutions, practices, commercial, technological, scientific, and pictorial. Of course, then this becomes very important. What kind of aesthetic is dominant? Early modern, modernist and avant-garde, and more recently late modern and postmodern. I already talked about this. Actually, what is a question, why this institutionalization of photography into kind of high art institution came so late. And I also talk about the important role of individuals, photographers, scientists, collectors, and art historians. And let me close with this, which is really our current challenge, and then we come back to Karel Havlíček-Borovský's statement about technology being the driver of permanent change. So the question is, how does the digital revolution reconfigure traditional practices and their narratives? For instance, the relation between finding and making, collecting and storing images. How should institutions such as museums deal with ever-changing image technologies? So I look forward to hearing these individual narratives in this conference and also discussing these questions. And I will finish my presentation with these two images, which might seem familiar. Of course, this is one response of contemporary society to the digital revolution. National Security Agency in the US and its British counterpart, which by itself poses a very serious question. Thank you.